Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. This is your host, Michael Shermer. Today is a special episode of the show. I'm titling it Putin and Power, a conversation with Dr. Jacek Kugler on how his power transition theory explains why Putin invaded Ukraine and what China and the U.S. should do about it. Dr. Jacek Kugler is the Elizabeth Helm Rosencrantz Professor of International Relations in the Department of Politics and Policy at Claremont Graduate University. Through extensive publications on the causes and consequences of war, he has forged a reputation for innovative formal modeling and empirical analysis. His path-breaking work on political performance provides for the first time a comprehensive political measure to compare and assess the capacity of governments to implement goals regardless of regime type or economic development. Dr. Kugler received his PhD from the University of Michigan and an MA and BA in political science from UCLA. He's the former president of the International Studies Association, the ISIA, and past president of Peace Science Society. Yes, there can be a science of peace. He has served as the co-editor of International Interactions. He was a faculty member at Vanderbilt University and Boston University and a research scholar at Harvard, as well as project director at the Center for Political Studies at the University of Michigan. He's a visiting scholar at UCLA, the California Institute of Technology, and the Hatfield School of Policy. He's also consulted for UNAIDS, IMF, the State Department, and a number of U.S. governmental agencies and private businesses. The work that Dr. Kugler has conducted has had a big effect on the research in his fields. For instance, his work on nuclear deterrence questioned the deduction that large threats could induce stability and anticipated the now recognized danger of nuclear proliferation to rogue and terrorist groups. His work on power transition explained the peaceful relations among the major powers during the Cold War, anticipated stability after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and forecast the upcoming Asian challenge. And his work on political demography disclosed that political factors play a leading role in the decline of fertility, big problem in Russia now, explaining the unexpected decline in China's population and anticipated that most of the developed world would face declining populations. Okay, in this conversation, we discuss his power transition theory and how that applies to Putin and Russia today. What does it mean for a nation to have power? I mean, Russia is an economic backwater. It's way down the rankings, but it has the most nuclear weapons in the world, except for possibly us. And obviously, the nuclear saber rattling has everybody nervous, so they must have some kind of power. We talk about, is Russia still a great power like it used to be as the Soviet Union? The relationship between a nation's economic strength and its political power, where China figures into the future of the New World Order. What happens if Putin succeeds in Ukraine? What happens if Putin fails in Ukraine? And so forth. So there's a lot on the table here. We're recording this on March 27th, Sunday morning. So things are changing by the hour and day here, so we'll see what happens. And I will planning on doing more of these conversations with people who are experts. Clearly, no one is an expert on everything regarding Putin and Russia. And so the more people you talk to, the more perspectives you get. And perhaps somebody in the State Department will even be watching some of these. Who knows? We'll see. All right. Enjoy this conversation with Dr. Kugler. And if you appreciate the podcast, do give us some support at skeptic.com/donate. Thanks for listening. This episode of the show is brought to you by Wondrium. This is the learning platform that provides access through a subscription service to all those great courses, as well as documentary series, great debates, learning platforms and programs from other companies. And so here's one, for example, of the great courses that I'm going to listen to for obvious reasons that you'll see in a moment. This one is called History of Russia, from Peter the Great to Gorbachev. That might be good to know at this point. This is 36 lectures, 30 minutes each, which you can get through in about 20 minutes when you listen to it at 1.2 or 1.3 speed, which I do. And so I'll probably do this course, 36 lectures, in about a week. That's pretty sweet. Understanding the Russian Past, The Russia of Peter the Great, The Age of Empresses like Catherine the Great, Social Rebellion. I'm just skipping along here. Nicholas I, The Birth of the Intelligentsia, Alexander II, The Nihilists, Lev Tolstoy, and all the way up to War and Revolution, The Democratic Russia in 1917, The Bolsheviks in Power, The Civil War, Lenin, Stalin, and the Great Terror, and the Soviet Union during the Second World War, what life was like in private Russia during all this time, and then Mikhail Gorbachev. So this course will need to be updated, apparently, I think. But in any case, here's the deal. You have access to that and all the other courses and all the other documentary series and learning programs for $99 a year if you do it through this program. So you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, and you get a free trial when you sign up for the $99, which is almost half off for the annual subscription. And that gets you access to all this great learning program. So check it out. wondrium.com/Shermer. All right, thanks for listening. Here's our show. Jacek Kugler, welcome to the show. Nice to see you. It's been a few years since I sat in on your class at Claremont Graduate University when I was writing my chapter on war. And I thought, well, I should study to see what the professionals do in this area. And you are one of the world's most respected scholars of war and peace. So that's a good place to start, I think. We are recording this on Sunday, March 27th. I just checked the news to see if Putin used any of his tactical nukes yet. No, not so far. And it's looked like the Ukrainians are still pushing back, so that's a good sign. So before we dive into your power transition theory and how it applies to Putin and Russia, give us just kind of your initial impressions about everything that's happened in the last month. Were you surprised? Were you not surprised that so many other people seem to be surprised?
Well, clearly, I think everybody's been somewhat surprised by the inefficiency of Russians and the effectiveness of the Ukrainian resistance. I think that clearly is generally agreed to. Before the invasion, my assessment was that Putin would have attempted to control Donetsk, where he has the majority Russian population, annex it and call it a victory. So what was surprising about Putin's move was that he attempted to basically invade Ukraine, and if he was really successful all the way he had been in Crimea, I believe he would have re-annexed it into Russia. And the second step would have been, if it hadn't been super successful, then he would have tried to do what he has done in Belarus, which is largely subservient to Russia. And I think that's what he told the Chinese he was going to do. and I believe he has failed. And the costs are now starting to escalate. And the main reason for this is that for some time the United States has focused on regional conflicts, like in the Middle East. And we have sort of escalated regional conflicts, including Vietnam, to sort of national security level. And so if you just looked at the world from this larger perspective, you'd notice that if all of the Middle East were to be shifted one way or the other, that's 5% of the world. That's 5% of the population and 5% of total output. And that is significant, but it certainly does not affect the security of the United States directly. The move that Putin has made has to be seen in the context of its connection to China. And as I will try to argue later, China is the key to the stability in Ukraine. And the main reason for that is that if you look at the map separately, just you will sort of notice that about 70% of the total world output and its population is located in Eurasia. That's Europe plus Asia. And if you add to that India, it's going to be more. Okay. And we are much smaller, that is all of America and currently Africa. So whatever entity controls Eurasia is the entity that controls the international system. And that's basically global strategy, one which we have not had since the Cold War. You may recall that during the Cold War, we invented a balance of power. And that is, we said that the Soviet Union, that is, Soviet Union plus the Warsaw Pact, was the equivalent to NATO. Any measure of capability suggests that that was a massive exaggeration. The Soviet Union never, with the Warsaw Pact, never approached more than 70% of US capabilities alone. But if you then counted the Europeans, then we're overwhelming. And the reason for stability in the international system has for a long period been the fact that the satisfied group, that's us, we're like, what's going on? We set up the rules, we instituted those rules, and we were dominant in that relationship. China doesn't come into the picture realistically as a major power until 1960, and they also have a conflict with the Russians in 1957, which is called the Sino-Soviet split. And while they are sort of equivalent or similar in their dissatisfaction, they're not similar in their aims. So the Russians had on one side unreliable China and much more powerful West. And when the collapse of the Soviet Union came along, we had great opportunities to restructure the international system the way we had restructured it after the end of World War II. Because what we managed to do after the end of World War II is basically create this preponderant coalition which is still in place. And at that time, Gorbachev, you may recall, met with Reagan in Iceland, and Gorbachev, realizing that he was so much smaller now that the Soviet Union had collapsed, proposed the reduction of nuclear weapons down to very, very low levels. Okay. Unfortunately, Reagan didn't see that as a possibility. We still teach in our classes that we're in a continuous protracted confrontation with the Soviet Union, and did it at that time. So the opportunity to settle with Russia and incorporate Russia into the West sort of was lost there. That was not the only time. Yeltsin and Clinton met in Helsinki right before the Baltic states were being incorporated into NATO. And the agreement there was that Russia would join later, okay? And they would join the G7, which became G8, and they did. They joined the World Trade Organization, which they did. And the key issue was now, could we basically move them into NATO? That would create a preponderant coalition for a long period of time. So we shouldn't underestimate the Russians, because what the Russians have is military capability. They really don't have much more. They're the size of Germany, as I can show. But they have very high military capabilities. So we miss really that opportunity. And it's not only our fault, it's both sides. Okay, when you don't trust somebody, it's very difficult to reach an agreement. Okay. And so if you keep that story going, okay, Putin comes into place, and things go more or less antagonistic, but not totally confrontational. And we do a couple of things. We try to deploy anti-ballistic missiles against Iran, which didn't have nuclear weapons. Okay. So the Russians say, why are you putting anti-ballistic missiles here? Okay. I say, so why don't you put them in in Kazakhstan? I say, no, but it's closer to Iran. So both sides basically were playing games. Okay. And those are really lack of trust games. And eventually Putin does what we all recall, which is invades Crimea. And when he invades Crimea, the game is, for practical purposes, over. He moves over to China and becomes, I call it, a vassal of China. Some people call it a second-tier state. And he says, look, I can either go west or east. My only choice is go to east. And the Chinese are more than happy to welcome him. By the way, at that time, the Chinese are also becoming more confrontational with the rise of the current Mr. Xi to power. So as this structure sort of moves in this direction, what we were not paying attention to, because of our massive focus on regional problems, particularly the Middle East, like Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, we just basically lost sight of who could hurt us, who could destabilize the international system. And the answer is simple: China. Okay, China is today the same size as the United States. We just keep claiming they're not. And we keep claiming that we can deal with the Chinese from a position of power. That means somehow you're larger than they are. That's not true. Now, with Europe and the United States, we are larger. But if Europe is ambivalent, we're not larger. We're either equal or becoming smaller. And that is not a very difficult notion. Is the Chinese started rising after 1960 in terms of economic development, and they will continue to rise at a rate faster than the United States. And it's not because the United States is in some ways restricted. It's simply because it's much easier to increase your income if you're making $5,000 a month to $6,000. And if you're making $100,000, it's a little harder to increase at the same proportion. And for us to grow faster, we need to have advanced technology. For them to grow faster, they can just basically copy a large number of things which are already in place and make them cheaper. Okay, and that is the advantage of underdevelopment. Okay, even though it's costly because they're poor. Okay, but there is no question that China will be larger than the United States, and they will be larger than the United States until about 275, when their population starts declining. They have also serious problems in terms of their population is going to be very old, starting in 235, and is going to continue to be very, very old to about 2050. And very old means more than 50% of the population is going to be over 60. So you look at this structure and you ask yourself, why do we have all the problems? Well, the main reason is we're satisfied and they're not. And you ask yourself, why? Okay. Well, there are a couple of reasons. China still believes that they need to expand into the China Sea, and they have issues with Taiwan. They have a dispute with India over territorial. They have a dispute with Japan. And to a large degree, they see themselves as being very large, but not listened to. We don't treat them the same. And the second thing is, we've been confrontational with China. Not that they are not. It's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. So getting back to Ukraine, both Russia and China are dissatisfied. And the Chinese are more than happy to have a medium size power, the size of Germany or the size of England, joining them. They have a larger territory, but for practical purposes, Russia today, their resources are a resource seller. So they're oil seller and basic food seller, and not much technology. We don't buy too many Russian things. Okay, we do buy a lot of Chinese things. So you have to ask yourself how come, and that is because Russia did not manage to sort of grab on to the opportunity to grow, and they have great dissatisfaction because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so if you're a Russian, you sort of think as a nationalist, and you say, well, I just lost Texas and we made a boo-boo. Why don't we bring Texas back? So we don't want to represent that in our representations. But for the Russians, Ukrainians are sort of, well, not Russians, but they're really not anything else but Russians. And so he's riding the nationalistic sort of fervor in Russia. And that's why he gets a lot of support. And he got enormous support in Crimea. The reason he was so successful in Crimea, I had that one map, but maybe you can put it later on, is that the majority of the population in Crimea is Russian. It's about 70% of Crimeans, maybe it's I'm a little off, 60% of Crimeans are Russians. Now, that doesn't mean that because you're Russian, you're not Ukrainian. It's like in California. You could be Latin American, and that doesn't mean that because you originally came from Mexico, that you're Mexican. But in this context, remember, it is a much shorter period of separation. Okay, so he was quite successful in Crimea because I would say the majority of the population was either in favor or indifferent to reacquisition by Russia. He has a very similar situation in the Donetsk region. That's the area which is heavily Russian. It's again more than 50% of people in Donetsk are Russians, and the rest are Ukrainians. But the rest of Ukraine is not like that. Okay, there's some minority Russian, but in some areas, particularly the West, it's less than 5 to 10%. So as he moves into Ukraine, he is now confronting people who don't like Russians. Okay, and there is a long history for why they would like or dislike each other.
Why do you suppose, Jacek, if I could just throw in a quick question, why didn't he just send in the little green men into the Donetsk area and just take it like he did Crimea, and then just go back to work and hope everybody just leaves him alone?
This is exactly what I believe the outcome is going to be. Most people who had quote-unquote rational analysis suggested that that's exactly what he should do. Okay, the West would not have reacted because, remember, we didn't react very much to the continuing conflict in Donetsk over the last 10 years, right? So that was an easy deal. Okay, but I believe he made a mistake. Okay, he thought that given the massive preponderance of Russia, that he could go into Ukraine and most of them are going to cave in. This is the part that we actually also misunderstood because all of the analysis suggested that Ukraine was going to fall within 10 to 20 days, and that is not the case. So there was a sort of misunderstanding of the relative commitment, and when I sort of saw the kind of resistance the Ukrainians had, I always ask myself, if not here, where? Okay, if not now, when? Okay, and notice that our previous conflicts in the regional conflicts, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where people we were not supporting the nationalist structures. We were fighting the nationalist structure. We were trying to change them. And here, you give them help, they'll do the fighting. So my notion always has been that if you're going to help somebody, find an ally who does the fighting and you do the supporting. If you are doing the fighting and they're doing the supporting, you're in the wrong place. You're likely to lose. And that's what's happening to Russia right now.
Yeah.
You have
So
a reverse.
another quick question. If what you say is factually true and well known, the percentage of Ukrainians that are either Russian or support Russia, surely his advisors would have told him that. Is the problem that he just is so isolated, he doesn't listen to his experts anymore?
No, I think he underestimated the willingness of the Russians, of the Ukrainians to resist. Remember, just previous to that, there was a semi-uprising in Belarus. Okay, and he came in, helped the government, which is probably a minority. We know it's a minority because they lost the election, and it just went poop. Okay, so you somehow he may have overestimated, but the key question, the reason Ukraine is so critical to us, is this is a fight over Eurasia. If Europeans are unwilling to fight over control of Ukraine, and we are unwilling, Chinese are sitting back there thinking, this is a soft target. So why don't we just pick one country, let's say Hungary first, which seems to be mezzo, maybe the Italians next, maybe the Greeks because they didn't like their financial status. And you sort of crawl in and have basically a shift of Europe towards accommodation with both Russia and China. And if that happens, the United States is unlikely to be a leading. We're going to be a big power, okay, but the control of the international system would shift from U.S. Europe to China and Russia, and eventually potentially India. And India is the critical actor. But today, in order to stabilize this international structure, Ukraine gives us a great opportunity. We've missed two before. And from my perspective is, how do I settle the system, the global system, so the 1.5 billion or 2 billion people who are currently more advanced in the sense of income and capacity to intervene, can maintain stability in the remaining 6 billion people, which we never think in terms of. And you can't do it if the top guys are fighting each other, because then everybody else is sort of taking the opportunity, and Africa will have great difficulties, but it's going, you basically Africanize the whole international system, because there is no potential to intervene in unstable environments. And in order to do that, we need to have either the cooperation of China, and if we don't have the cooperation of China, we need to persuade India to join us, and then you join India plus Europe plus the US. It's again preponderant. It's a sort of replication of the Cold War. But if we don't do that, if let's say only US and Europe stick together, and Russia and China continue to be dissatisfied, we are going to have a Cold War, which this time can become easily hot instead of the previous one, because
right. So in the previous
larger.
one we had lots of proxy wars based on this domino theory that if this little country here falls, then the next one will fall, and so on. And what you just described, maybe Hungary's, if we don't stop them in Ukraine, maybe Hungary's next, maybe Italy, maybe Greece, and so on. That sounds like a domino theory. And that therefore your recommendation might be that the U.S. has to fight these little proxy wars so that it doesn't escalate?
Well, see, what you want to do is avoid proxy wars. So the first thing is illegal expansion into Ukraine, the way we see it, okay, is important. But see, notice that there are other alternatives. If Putin had wanted to challenge the current status of Ukraine, he could have called on the United Nations and say, why don't you run an election of national self-determination? We're willing to withdraw. You run it. We don't. Okay, of course, he doesn't get credit then. And then I believe Crimea would have gone to Russia. And I believe some area of Donetsk would go to Russia. But the problem is you can't keep doing this because there are so many migrants. But exactly that's what happened in Kosovo, as you recall. Kosovo wanted to pull out of Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia said, hey, wait a minute, this is mine, okay? And the reason why we today have Kosovo is because the population of Kosovo wishes not to be part of Serbia. So I think that there are ways of solving problems which are not confrontational and not conflictual. Once you start playing the game conflictually, that I'm bigger and I'm going to take it, and I'm bigger here, therefore I'm going to take it, you end up in really serious problems. But the far more important issue here is that this is a confrontation over control of global control of the international structures. The regional conflicts should not be confused with this kind of conflict. This is serious. The other ones, I don't mean to minimize them because lots of people die, but those are marginal to the stability of the international system. So moving on to China, yeah.
Well, I was going to say Korea. I mean, again, that conflict is actually never ended, right? It's just sort of a long truce at the moment between North and South Korea, and but let me go back to the economic aspects of great powers.
On Korea for a second.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Notice about Korea. Korea is divided, right? South Korea is today 10 times larger than North Korea. So if those two were alone, okay, South Korea would invade North Korea and do it in 2 hours. Okay, so if you're Mr. Kim, you say, I realize that the other, I pretend to be big, but I'm not. Okay, so I'm going to compensate with nuclear weapons. And we always keep talking about Mr. Kim attacking the United States, which is insane. Because if he were to throw a nuclear device on the United States and destroy any city you want, that would be the beginning of South Korea becoming an island. Because we would retaliate at such level that nobody would survive in North Korea. And if you think I'm kidding, that's exactly what we will do. There's no question about it. Okay. Would be massive retaliation, instant. Okay. And so we're sort of playing a game that has not, midgets do not threaten giants, okay? No more than a nuclear, Honduras could threaten the United States. But what is far more important here is the following. Remember, Mr. Kim is right next door to to China, and he's right next door to Russia. And while his range may allow him to drop 1 or 2 nuclear devices on us, his range allows him to destroy Beijing and Shanghai easily. Now, would you like that neighbor? So
yeah, no, I wouldn't. So what's China going to do about that?
What China faces. So the reason why I emphasize in my little papers the problems that China has is you want to settle the Korean peninsula in such a way that it's acceptable to China, and I'm certain that removing nuclear weapons from Mr. Kim's hands is one of the things he wishes. The Chinese wish. They don't want us on their border. That I understand. Okay. So here is a possibility of reunifying Korea, okay, and allowing the US to be on the border outside, or so there are the possibilities. But we have to think in terms of, here is a large power which is also threatened, okay, or they seem to be threatened. Of course, the biggest problem is Taiwan, and I don't know how to solve that. If I did, I would be an oracle in the UN.
Okay. But in what way is since you emphasize economics as a component of a great power, in what way is Russia a great power? If it didn't have nukes, would we even be concerned about this?
That's what I try to emphasize. Russia is now a second-tier power, and because of the events following the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's become a vassal of China. Whatever China tells them to do, Russia can do. Without support by China, so if we want to settle the Ukrainian crisis tomorrow, the only thing we have to do, which is what I would have done, is send a mission to China and said, okay, let's figure out how we run the international system. But the condition for that is you pull out of support of Russia. Period. So if they imposed not even the kind of sanctions that we have imposed, but if they just simply withdrew support for Russia, Russia would immediately leave Ukraine. They just can't, you can't do it. People say, oh, look, the Chinese can't do this. Yes, they can. Because if you cut the oil supplies, which at the same rate, or you embargo their payments, Russia is not large enough to sustain a confrontation between the China, United States, and Europe. That's nonsense. Our problem is we have the Europeans now, but we don't have the Chinese. Okay? Because we never recognized the structure of the international system. And we still don't. We still are trying to tell the Chinese what to do. Okay? Instead of saying, what do we do together? Okay? And look at the China road. Okay? If I were today, I would say, okay, how do I persuade the Chinese that I really mean to be a better friend? I would send them 500 pills that we have now for COVID, okay, for free. No invitation. Okay. Oh, by the way, we have some extra vaccines. We just send them. I know you don't need them because you have your own that don't work, but don't worry. We just happen to have the surplus, and it just appeared. Okay. It's a little difficult because the current government of China is not as receptive as the previous government of China. So we missed some opportunities in the previous. But we are now creating a Cold War the way we did before. And the main reason for that is because we constantly teach international politics as being confrontational. That's the realist view. We live in anarchy. And there are really no rules, and the rules are imposed by power. Well, if that were the case, we would have invaded Canada a long time ago. Or you certainly would have taken them over during World War II. We would go to the English and say, you have this nice little colony, I'll help you, but Canada would be nice. If we were sort of seeking hegemony, that's what we would do. And we don't. So what the realists do not understand is you can play confrontation, but confrontation leads to war, period. The longer you confront, at some point, one of you will either mistakenly or accidentally or whatever, create a conflict. If you move all the way to cooperation, like the Europeans, okay, assume that there is a nuclear accident and one of the English submarines shoots a nuclear missile that happens to hit accidentally I don't know, some part of the US, do you think we immediately would react and destroy England?
No.
No. See, the problem is it's not nuclear weapons. It's your expectation of the other person. So when you are cooperating, that let's say the French and the English, they blow up something, they'll say, oh, Jesus, how did they do that? Okay. Our problem is we don't recognize cooperation in the international system. We almost poo-poo it as naive, idealistic, silly, any word you like, okay? Because you're not a real person if you're trying to seek cooperation. Now, it's stupid to say that we're going to move from the position of confrontation with China and Russia and move all the way to integration. That's silly. But if you say, I want to move away from confrontation to competition, okay, it's an intermediate step. We have some level of trust, but I'm trying to get the best I can out of you, and you're trying to get the best out of me. And you sort of deal very differently with people like that.
So there was that story last week that that Putin contacted Xi and asked the Chinese to help him with Ukraine. I guess by your analysis, that would mean he's asking for more than they're already helping him. And what are they already doing besides just sending money?
And what is there are two countries that should worry us. China has not said anything that what Putin is doing is illegal. Neither has India. Okay. And the second part of it is they're now today negotiating on the India territorial disputes with China. Suddenly they found that it's a good time to negotiate a resolution of that. So one of the things you have to ask yourself, is there a shift in which the Indians, even though they're democratic, quote unquote, but they may want to shift towards China? If that happens, the current, let's say, international structure is going to dramatically be changed. Because China, India, Russia dominate us by far. You're talking about almost 4 billion people against 1. Okay, we're richer and this and that, and we're more sort of divided in many ways because we're democratic, so everybody pulls in different directions. So those are the kind of issues that you have to sort of think in terms of global strategies. Now, if you're only interested in stability, you really don't care who dominates. Okay. If you're interested in the kind of stability I would prefer to see, with some norms that I strongly believe in, then it would be useful to maintain these norms with adjustments. It's not caving in. It's adjusting your norms to incorporate people who don't have the same norms as yours.
What would be the most important norms? Just give us a couple of the norms you're talking about here.
Well, I personally believe, by the way, some of these things we have in common. For instance, equality, particularly of females. We keep forgetting that the Chinese also have the same principles, and the Russians to a large degree do. So we have that in common. Okay. But effective participation, freedom of press and effective participation, it's quite clear that the authoritarian regimes are moving to a more efficient control of the interaction space than ever in the past, as you can see by the fact that the Russians believe in a completely different story in Ukraine, okay, and they're getting a completely different story. And unfortunately, in the United States, that's also happening. We seem to have two stories. Okay, one's Fox News and the other one non-Fox News. So it's a really complicated thing, but at least we have the freedom to fight over which one is the real reality. I think that is essential in a society, and you have to participate largely because you want to support the government rather than you're coerced by the government. Those are the kind of things I would be I would hate to see lost in exchange
Given the
for
importance
stability.
of economic production to a great power, let's rewind the tape back to the mid-90s and, Yeltsin's sort of handpicking the ex-KGB officer. But if he hadn't done that, what if he would have picked somebody who was, pro-Western, pro-free market, didn't want to set up a kleptocracy, and then spent the next 25 years just becoming an economic powerhouse? Could they have then become a true great power?
No. Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost so much of its population and its potential that they would be a big power, like Germany is, like Britain is, in that range. But they could never compete beyond that point with either China or India or the United States, or in the future, if there ends up being a Sub-Saharan Africa Union, they're going to be larger than both India and China together. So by the end of the century. So we just don't think in those terms today because we're always used to, 5 years is sort of the range that we think in terms of, instead of 50 or 75.
Are you talking about a united Africa type union, like a UN?
Well, yes,
an
if that
EU?
happened, now it wouldn't not be very relevant. But by the end of the century, Sub-Saharan Africa, as I said, is going to be larger than India and China combined. So they're going to have the largest active population. Also, remember, we are going to be much older, relatively speaking. China will be dramatically older because of the one-child policy, and India is going to start getting older. And Africa is going to have the kind of population that China had in the 1960s, humongous amount of young people and very few old people. Okay, so the potential for growth is phenomenal.
Just to clarify that, by older, you mean the percentage of population, say, above 65 that needs to be supported by 65. A younger working age? Yeah.
And you're talking 18 to 65. And I believe that that's going to change too because of health and stuff like that. So the 65 is going to end up being 75. But that's slightly different. But that's where the huge potential is. Now, whether they take advantage of it or they squander it, it's a completely different story. Okay. It's not
but
easy.
I think what I was getting at with the kleptocracy thing is that Putin clearly and his oligarch buddies have essentially robbed the wealth of the majority of Russian people in the name of, I don't know what, nationalism or just thievery, or there's this talk that he wants to cobble together the old Soviet Union, and he has these kind of revanchist dreams because he's kind of an autocratic psychopath or something. Just give us a little insight into Putin's psyche and what you think he might be up to.
Well, unfortunately, that's not my strength. I do believe that Putin always compares himself to
one of the czars or Peter the Great.
To the Tsar, but Peter the Great, okay? And think of what Peter the Great was trying to do. Peter the Great realized that Russia was relatively backward comparing to Europe. So what he wanted to do is move west to acquire the technology from the West and grow Russia. Putin did exactly the opposite. See, think of Yeltsin's time of death. Okay, at that time, major investments of by Europe were transferred to Russia. They had almost complete technological access. We were providing money to maintain the economy. And had he gone west and joined the European Union, which was feasible, okay, he would now be the largest member of the European Union. He would actually be controlling, not controlling totally, but he would be larger than Germany because it's by number of people, and larger than France. Okay, and we didn't know the English would leave, but he currently would be the dominant person in the European Union. Well, he just decided not to do that. It's always difficult to figure out if it's one side or the other, but I believe that if you don't trust me, okay, you're not going to take a risk. And you always take a risk for peace or you take a risk for war. And what he did is he went over to China, settled his territorial dispute, and sort of became the best friend of the next biggest guy in the world. Okay, so we call that first mover. Okay, and consequently, he's having some benefits, and the Chinese are still sticking by him. But in terms of the relative influence of Russia, he has almost no influence in China. He's 10% of China. Had he been in Europe, he would have had, let's say, 30% of influence over all of Europe. But I can rerun stories, and definitely he would have done economically far better. Not even, it's almost impossible to compare the opportunities he lost by not moving to an advanced environment where there would be technology transfers and he has an educated population. So that, look at the growth of Poland. It's the fastest in Europe. Russia should have been growing faster than Poland has. So I would suggest that is a massive, if you're thinking in terms of Russians' importance into the future, I think he made a massive mistake.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about nationalism and what it means to be a nation or a nation state. I mean, there's all this talk about, the Russian character, the Russian people. Are they more like Westerners or are they their own people? Is it just the language? Well, they speak Russian in this eastern part of Ukraine, so they're Russian. But it's not just that, right? It's also culture and history and so forth, music, food, whatever. How do you think about what does it mean to be part of a nation and nationalism?
Well, look, they're all, you're Polish, right? And I don't see Russians as being negative. I've always, I've had really great friends in Russia. And my best friend is Ukrainian from Argentina. Okay. So there is a common history, again, and a common, remember Poland used to run Ukraine, and then the Russians ran Ukraine, and the Ukraine then became independent on her. So these people have been sort of around each other for quite some time, and they have a lot of things in common. But it is extraordinarily difficult once you establish a nation state with recognition of it, okay, by the population, to dismantle that notion, okay? So, for instance, if you're some economist, you say, how come, or Baja California doesn't rebel and join the United States, okay? And you say, well, that's absurd, right? I mean, we're sitting here, I say, of course they would make a lot more money. They would look like Florida. Okay. They would have housing, all over the place. and everybody would be investing in it. And so you must be kidding. Okay. There is a certain point in which you establish nation states, and they make sense themselves. That's why integration is such a critical differential step. The Europeans figured out that they could be English and Germans. That is, in terms of the economy, they could be Germans, sell everywhere, okay? And in terms of self-awareness, they can still be French, and they can still be Germans. And that kind of process is the one that I would advocate, for instance, for us. We should expand NAFTA to look like the European Union. And hopefully the Latin Americans would sort of, because then you have much more economic oomph. You have lift. You can, you don't depend so much. They can't split you into little pieces. And if the Latin Americans did that, they would actually be players in the international system. And the same thing for us. We should right now be thinking in terms of an expanded NAFTA. I'm not trying to become Mexican, and I'm not trying to become Canadian. I'm trying to have a common economic structure that allows us to have much more presence in the international system in this larger globalized environment. And the Europeans have taught us how to do it. We should learn from it. We always say, oh, it's great for Europe, but somehow it's not great for us. And I'm going, yeah. See what I mean? We really have this notion that we're so large we don't need it. That is wrong. We're not that large.
It's the norms you're talking about. So the reason we don't take Canada and Baja California is because you just don't do that. And we could, but you just don't do that. So we're not going to do that.
Force. But why don't we integrate?
Yeah, through trade.
Why
travel.
do we stop saying, people constantly talk about immigration from Latin America. Well, the current levels of immigration into Mexico are larger than the level of immigration from Mexico. Because we haven't recognized that Mexico is no longer growing at humongous rates. They're basically maintaining their own populations. And just think how effective it would be if we had the opportunity to move over there and they had the opportunity to move over here. I do not buy this notion of immigration is necessarily great, but it also don't buy the notion that immigration is not good. If you look at Europe, Spain is one of the poorest, as well as Portugal. There is very little immigration from Portugal and Spain to either Germany or Netherlands, which have a much higher levels of income. People do go to work there for a while and then they go home, okay? Because it's easy, you can move. And the opportunities are much better. So what I'm simply saying is if we believe that Europeans are gaining economically through the European Union, which we constantly advertise, what's wrong with us? How come we don't do any of it? It's only good for them? That doesn't make sense as a general theoretical proposition.
Right. Well, sure. I wonder how much this war is going to cost Putin/Russia, as opposed to if they just had purchased whatever it is that they want from Ukraine. Just open up the trade avenue and just purchase whatever you want.
Well, it's going to devastate. It definitely will devastate Russia, regardless of the outcome. Okay, whether they succeed or they fail. I believe what they're going to do is they're going to annex Donetsk and keep Crimea. And because of that annexation, the sanctions are going to continue from the West. And the shift away from dependence on Russia is going to accelerate because now Europeans are, before they say, no, they'll never do it. Now they know that they might, okay? The problem is going to be how to recover Ukraine, bring them back to some semblance of normality. There are going to be problems in Georgia because the Russians have now pulled out of at least parts of Georgia, and the Georgians are starting to get active again. So you're going to have border problems. And it's not going to be good for the Europeans, and it's not going to be good for the Russians, and it's not going to be good for us, because we're going to re-energize our military expenditures instead of our, let's say, cooperative ventures. So my hope is that we sort of look at this and say, do I want that world, or do I want a slightly different world? And again, the key to that slightly different world is China. So if we reconcile to some degree with China,
let's say China does nothing. Let's say China stays on the sidelines. Putin neither wins nor loses in Ukraine. It just drags on for months and then maybe years. The Ukrainian people refuse to ever go along, short of just Russian soldiers going door to door and shooting them. They can't take over a country if the country refuses to go along, and there's no puppet regime that any Ukrainian ever obeys. They don't pay any taxes, and you just have, years of, I don't know what it would be, civil war or just internal strife. It seems like that could bankrupt Russia also.
Yes. Well, I don't, not only it would bankrupt Russia, it would basically destroy the eastern side of Europe. That would, Belarus would be involved in there, because their current government is going to become increasingly unpopular. In Ukraine, you're going to have look at what happened in Afghanistan. They ended up with 20 years of war and a massive human disaster. You might in effect be, if your scenario is realistic, okay, you may in effect end up with something similar, in which Europe, as NATO borders, is going to be super rich, and then you have two disaster areas, which is Ukraine and Belarus, and a much poorer Russia beyond that. So that's not what I would hope for.
So we've seen on the nightly news, ABC News has been reporting from Poland about the, 1 to 2 million people that have already, refugees have already gone there. What do you hear from your friends, family, colleagues there about how it's going and what the future could hold if this drags on?
My family, basically, they've asked us for money, so we sent some, and they're renting houses and putting Ukrainians in. And my expectation is that Ukrainians are not going to stay in Poland. They're going to keep on going to Germany. Remember, Ms. Merkel wanted to bring a lot of Syrians, particularly more educated Syrians, into Germany, and that sort of backfired against her politically. Bringing Ukrainians, Germany needs active population because they're aging. The same problem as other parts. I believe that the Ukrainians are going to be absorbed easily within Europe. Unfortunately, that's sort of a little bit of a racist content. Okay, Ukrainians will be welcome where Syrians were not, which is Poland. And
well, I don't know if it's racist. Is it culture? Again, back to nationalism, Jacek. Is it just we're more willing to accept people that are culturally or politically like us as opposed to, or religiously also?
I think that is quite obvious. All these people have sort of Christian values. Okay, so it's a little change here and there. They speak a language like Polish and Ukrainian are very similar. So, 2 hours of retraining and you change your accent. Okay. And they have, to a large degree, particularly in the western part of Ukraine, have for many years been sort of English-oriented. So they will have English bases, okay? And so I believe that the migrants from Ukraine are going to do very, very well in Europe. And in fact, they're going to be very desirable. And what's going to be hard is if Ukraine sort of succeeds and ends up being a restructured entity is to bring those people back from income levels that are sort of much higher than the ones that they can expect in Ukraine. So I don't think that this is a migration that's
I have
going
a
to
dumb
be very,
question.
very difficult to absorb.
If you're a foreign leader, if you're Putin and
Yeah.
you want to take over a country and you've leveled it so that you're just bouncing the rubble, as they say, what is there to take over? What's the game plan? Like, we're just going to rebuild it and spend trillions of dollars?
Well, yeah, you have the problem you have is exactly the problem people had in after World War II, and after World War I, nobody helped, and there was a humongous depression and on and on. After World War II, to our credit, we provided the Marshall Plan, which, by the way, did not change the structure, but what it did, it maintained a minimum level of income so that people saw that they could go up. If you don't have enough, you basically fall into what's called the poverty trap, and things get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and no matter what so you start stealing and you do anything you can. But if you start, even if you're very low, and you suddenly next week you make a little bit more, and then a little bit more, so it's sort of the recovery structure. Okay, I've done a lot of work on that. So the Marshall Plan, what it did, it didn't save the Europeans, but what it did is change the trajectory of Europe from one that would go down and up to one that went up immediately. Okay, and that's another. It's consequence of war. I have that. But the key question here is, I believe Ukraine is not huge. So once the fighting stops, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for investment. They also have really good agriculture, which Europe needs. I believe that they will recover quite rapidly. The problem is Russia, because if Russia continues to be isolated, as I expect they would be, no matter which outcome is going to follow, because they still have Crimea, people haven't recognized it. It's much harder to recognize Crimea today than it was before this war. Okay, and if they take Donetsk, which is what I believe they will do, okay, because we don't want to fight and the Ukrainians don't have enough oomph to push them out. Okay, so if you have sort of this remaining Ukraine with the strip, which is now Russia, okay, they're going to get isolated, and their only source of support is China. Okay, and there could be India, but I'm not so sure about them because they don't have any money. But once you have, I see a really dark time for Russia, unless there is a humongous change in government, which I do not anticipate.
Yeah. Okay, Jacek, you've worked for the State Department. I mean, you've consulted with the State Department and other government agencies. Let's just run a hypothetical tomorrow. The State Department calls your office and says, Dr. Kugler, we'd like your advice on what we should do this week, next month, in the next 6 months, in the next year. Should we send planes over? Should we just send money? Should we enforce the no-fly zone? But we're worried that this is going to escalate and bring NATO in, and then we have NATO versus Russia and the Warsaw Pact, and then all of a sudden tactical nuclear weapons are used, and then you have thermonuclear war. So we don't want to even do that. What should we do?
Well, my answer was simply first try the Chinese, okay, and see if you can basically move them away, because that pushes away from the confrontational side. In terms of the military involvement, I have to admit I'm very seldom an aggressive type, okay, because I usually don't gain much through conflict. But in this situation, I would be more inclined to say that provide even more, particularly anti airplanes.
Yeah, missiles.
There's that's what devastating Ukraine. I don't know, I'm not sure, but I probably would allow the Poles to give them the planes. But see, you're asking questions that I have no expertise in. In order to do that, you really have to do a serious agent-based analysis to see where these people are and what do they see as threatening to them. You can't do it. See, one of the problems of macro analysis is really wonderful. I can tell you really with some degree of certainty what's going to happen by the year 200, at the end of the century, by 250, by 275, who's going to be playing, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And then you say, well, can you tell me what should I do next week? And the answer is no. Because I have no information on decision makers. Now, we've done that kind of analysis, which I have not been privy to, for instance, in the Middle East. And we were trying to get a settlement between the Israelis and Palestinians under Obama. And the settlement was agreed to. Water, division of land, on and on and on. When the previous guy who ran Israel, what's his name? Not
Bibi?
the current one.
Oh yeah, I
Anyway,
know. Yeah, I can picture him, but I can't remember call the name.
Yeah, the name escapes.
Not Netanyahu.
But Netanyahu, there we go. Okay, Netanyahu figured out, hey, there's going to be a resolution of the West Bank. I can't afford that. He moves out. Okay, boom. So you go, I've been working for you to settle the situation for you, but you don't want the settlement. You just wanted the pretense of the settlement. Once the settlement comes, you don't want it. Okay, so in this agent-based modeling, what you need to do is figure out what the agents are. Okay, and then you can move them or not. In the Ukrainian situation, all of the analysis shows that I haven't done it. I just heard, from friends, okay, that the shift is Ukrainians want to continue the fight. We don't. Okay, the Russians find out that they can settle on maintaining Donetsk. Okay, and that's what they do, and we agree, and the Ukrainians don't. That's basically what I believe the outcome is likely to be. But to really know, you really have to do decision-making analysis, and anybody who tells you that they know is just making it up. So
that's funny. Yes.
and
Well,
my
given that,
opinion is no better than that of anybody, any other person who is knowledgeable in this area.
Although I could imagine if Putin calls Xi and Xi says, hey, look, we thought this was going to be over in a couple of days. This is dragging on too long. You need to pull out of Ukraine and stop this now, or else we're going to withdraw all our support. That could get Putin's attention.
No, that would. But the key question is, how do you persuade Xi to say that?
Yes, right. Well, right. So we probably have to give him stuff.
He's got to get some. Okay, and that is the hard trade-off, because but it's not only for now. It's not only for this instance. It's for the whole continuation of the relationship. Okay, and this is the part that I think is completely missed. I looked at the early coverage on Ukraine, and it was all Putin. The Europeans are talking to Putin. My mother is talking to Putin. My grandmother is talking to Putin. Okay, and I said, wait a minute. You shouldn't be talking to them. You should be talking to the potential source of changing it. And when we decided to put sanctions, I never heard anybody saying, by the way, we invited the Chinese to discuss the level of sanction that should be. See, notice that we're really treating a major power as if it didn't exist. or as we can impose on them whatever our preferences are. And that has to change. If it doesn't, we're going to have a very complex, controversial, and potentially conflictual interaction in the next 5
50 years or so. Yes. All right, Jacek, you've been generous with your time. I appreciate it on a Sunday morning here. Let me just hit one last topic I find completely intractable, and maybe you can help me walk us through this, and that is U.S. foreign policy. When should we intervene? When should we not? Just looking back, we didn't intervene in the Rwanda genocide because of the Black Hawk Down thing in Somalia that happened before that. And so we got hammered for that. And then we intervened in Kosovo, and Clinton gets, reamed for that because we're the world's policeman. And, we invade Iraq and Afghanistan. It's 20 years of war, just complete waste of money. What are we doing? But don't we have a moral obligation to help people that are oppressed? Yes, we do. But there's lots of those, and we help some and we don't help others. Why do we, what leads us to make some of those decisions, and what's the kind of rational way to go about that?
Well, actually, that is what my little papers are about. I think the United States lost its grand strategy when the Soviet Union collapsed. When the Soviet Union was present, that was the danger to the US. So any action that the Russians did, we tried to counter, and any action they did, we countered and stuff like that. So, but we had really a clear version. The danger is USSR Warsaw Pact, and we are here trying to protect it. And the sort of peripheries were sort of important, but not important. And think how we were trying to sell Vietnam. We're not trying to say Vietnam is important. We're trying to say there's a domino theory, okay, on and on, okay? Whether that was correct or not, that's not the point. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we didn't have a global strategy. We just had regional strategies. The Middle East became important. Terrorism was equivalent to nuclear war. On and on and on. We completely lost sight of the problem that the people who can hurt us and can hurt what we want to maintain, which is global stability, have to be large, okay, and capable, and unlike us. And we completely lost interest in China. Obama finally shifted to China, but his shift was confrontational rather than what can we do together, not recognizing that they're going to be. So the question is, we don't want to be policemen of the world. That clearly is not the case. What you want to do is say, I want to have a stable international environment. How do I maintain a stable international environment? Unlike balance of power theorists, we believe that requires a preponderant, stable coalition. Okay? That means the people, the guys who have all of the resources have to be preponderant. And let me give you an illustration of what we just wrote in a new book with Kang, and that is we are arguing that given the spread of nuclear weapons, little people now can have nuclear weapons. North Korea, is a basket case. It's almost one of the poorest countries in the world, and now has sophisticated nuclear weapons capable of destroying Japan. Okay? So you can't say that somebody very small can no longer threaten somebody much larger, or even us, or even China. So what you want to now do is say, okay, I'm going to have to choose on regional confrontations. But the ones that are important are nuclear, for instance. So create a nuclear security council with no veto. And we just tell you, okay, anybody who starts a first strike, no matter who it is, either us or China or Russia or the Europeans are going to retaliate. And we won't intervene. So let's say the Israelis attack Iran. We don't do anything. The Russians do it. We say, oh, we didn't see it. You need to have global stability. You don't have global stability, you have regional instability, and regional instability leads you to global instability. So the game here, in my opinion, is let's get back to a global strategy for the US. Unfortunately, we are no longer preponderant. So we can't do it alone. We have to do it with somebody else. We know who the potential partners are. Very simple. European Union, China, and India. That's it. So create a coalition with them, and you can maintain the system. If these people are divided, you are going to have massive conflict, both regional and otherwise. And in regional areas like Middle East, it is absurd for us, for instance, to argue that Iran should not have nuclear weapons, but Israel should have it. It's absurd. It's only good because we like it. So we have to say, I understand the problem. I want a nuclear-free zone here, and we will guarantee it. But you can't have this game of, well, if you're my enemy, I'll treat you like this, and if you're my friend, I'll treat you like this. It makes no sense for stability. And everybody understands that, but we don't want to articulate it. And as long as we have this sort of incomprehensible theory, no proliferation except if they're good guys, okay, that doesn't make sense. Okay. And because what we define as good may be defined as bad by the opponent. Okay. So it is really important to have a consistent strategy that tries to maintain international global stability that then leads to some degree of regional stability. And that's the way I would try to approach it.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me, Jacek. I really appreciate your time. That the bigger picture it comes into view now, I think. Just one last question. On the kind of margins of the conversation, with maybe extreme versions, you hear people like Noam Chomsky saying, yes, Putin invading Ukraine was bad, but Bush invaded Iraq, so he's a war criminal too. It's kind of a moral equivalency argument. How do you respond to those kind of criticisms of U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I did not favor the invasion of Iraq by Mr. Bush. The other part as to moral, look, if you distort reality, and we did, it's equivalent to somebody else's distortion of reality. Okay, but see, you're asking me to moralize. I don't. Okay, my problem is we can't say that Mr. Putin. He has also arguments. I'm trying to reunify my country. Okay, so you can't say that a country can claim previous, damages and therefore absorb it. Okay, Poland could then invade Belarus because it used to be part of Poland. Okay, at some point you have to stop. Okay, and so if we follow that, okay, logic, the invasion of Iraq is not justified, and the invasion of Ukraine is not justified. The other part is perfunctory. Okay, I don't take positions. I don't have a political preference one way or the other. My preference is for international stability, and I try to seek ways in which we can stabilize the international system to the benefit of all of us, not just some of us, to the benefit of all of us. And that's why I think that the exit ramps are through integration and stuff like that.
Yep. No, that's why I always admired your work. It's very scientifically oriented, data oriented, empirical. Just how do you answer this particular question? How do we get international stability? Here's the
Well,
formula,
we're going to
more
try
or
to
less.
answer that in a book with Ron Kamin, but it's
Oh,
it's
what's
going to
that?
take a little while.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Probably next year.
I would call it Putin and power, something punchy like that.
Well, see, I'd probably don't not call it that, and nobody will read it.
All right, Jacek, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was fun.